The shop smelled of suspended time, a cocktail of synthetic whale oil, stale tobacco smoke, and the metallic tang of brass that had been waiting in the dark for a century. Outside, the London rain was a relentless, gray curtain, drumming against the bay window of Thorne's horology. But inside, the rhythm was different. It was a polyrhythmic symphony of 300 distinct ticks, tocks, and whirs, a chaotic choir that only Elias Thorne could conduct. Elias sat hunched over his workbench, the focal point of his world narrowed down to the diameter of a jeweler's loop. He was a man composed of sharp angles and hesitant movements, possessed of hands that were only steady when they held steel tools. He was currently dissecting the hairspring of a Victorian pocket watch, holding his breath as if the very exhalation might disturb the delicate balance of the universe. The bell above the door chimed, a bright, intrusive G-sharp that shattered his concentration. Elias didn't look up immediately. He carefully placed the tweezers on the velvet mat, exhaled the breath he'd been holding, and swiveled his stool around. "We are closed," Elias said, his voice rusty from hours of disuse. "The sign is turned." "The sign is wrong," a woman's voice replied. It was a voice like the interior of a cello, rich, resonant, and carrying a vibrato of suppressed anxiety. "Or at least for this it is." Elias adjusted his spectacles. Standing in the threshold, dripping wet and shaking a collapsed umbrella, was a woman who looked as though she had stepped out of a monochrome photograph and been violently colorized. She wore a trench coat belted tightly at the waist, and her dark hair was plastered to her cheek. But it was her eyes that caught him, amber, sharp, and terrified. "I'm Elena Rosetti," she said, stepping further into the shop, dragging a heavy, canvas-wrapped object behind her on a dolly. "And I was told you are the only man in London who doesn't ask questions before he asks for a price." Elias stood up, wiping his hands on his apron. "Then you were misinformed. I ask plenty of questions, usually about the escapement mechanism." "This isn't a joke, Mr. Thorne." She wrestled the object upright. It was tall, roughly 6 feet, shrouded in the heavy canvas. "I have something that belongs to my family, or it did until yesterday. I need you to open it." "Open it? If it's a clock, it's not a safe, Miss Rosetti." "It's the Obsidian King," she said. The air in the shop seemed to drop 10 degrees. Elias froze. He looked from her face to the shrouded shape. "The 1927 sterling commission? That's a myth. A ghost story for apprentices." "It's not a myth," Elena said, her fingers trembling as she undid the straps. "And Victor Sterling knows it exists. He's the one who found it. I stole it back." Elias moved around the counter, his curiosity overriding his instinct for self-preservation. "You stole from Victor Sterling? The man who owns half the auction houses in Europe? That's not theft, Miss Rosetti, that's suicide. He doesn't know I have it. Yet." She pulled the canvas down. Elias stopped breathing. Standing before him was a monolith of horological excess. It was Art Deco incarnate. The casing was not wood, but a seamless, towering slab of polished obsidian, dark as a starless night. Inlaid into the stone were geometric veins of platinum and gold, rising like skyscrapers in a metropolis. But the face was the masterstroke. It was an open-heart design, revealing the gears behind a chapter ring of frosted crystal. The pendulum bob wasn't a disc, but a sphere of heavy brass, etched with the signs of the zodiac. It was magnificent. It was terrifying. It was dead. The hands, sleek, rhodium-plated daggers, were frozen at 11:58. "It doesn't run," Elena whispered, hugging her arms. "It hasn't run in 90 years. My great-grandfather commissioned it, and then the tragedy happened. It's been in a vault ever since." Elias stepped closer, his aversion to human drama momentarily eclipsed by the lust of the craftsman. He reached out, his fingers hovering inches from the cold stone. "The movement, it looks like a Graham deadbeat but modified, double-weighted." "I don't care about the weights," Elena snapped, though her eyes darted to the rain-lashed window. There is a rumor, a family legend, that when the clock was built, something was sealed inside it. Not just time, information. Elias looked at her over the rim of his glasses. You want me to play treasure hunter? I want you to make it tick, she said. Sterling thinks it's just a trophy. He wants it for the collection. But if the legend is true, if there's something inside, I need to find it before he tears my life apart looking for it. If I touch this, Elias said softly, and Sterling finds out, my shop burns down. That's usually how he operates. Elena reached into her coat and pulled out a thick envelope. She placed it on the counter. 50,000 pounds. Half now. Half when you find what's hidden. Elias looked at the money, then back at the clock. The Obsidian King loomed over them, a dark sentinel from a jazz-age nightmare. He could feel the mechanical complexity of it radiating outward, a puzzle demanding to be solved. The money was good, yes, but the challenge? The challenge was irresistible. Lock the door, Elias said, turning to his tool bench, and help me get this beast onto the lift. 3 hours later, Elena Rosetti was gone. She had vanished into the rain with a promise to return at dawn, leaving Elias alone with the Obsidian King. The shop was silent now, save for the ambient ticking of the lesser clocks. Elias had drawn the heavy velvet curtains and engaged the deadbolts. He brewed a pot of black coffee, the steam rising in the cool air, and approached the monolith. He had moved it to the central operating table, a sturdy slab of oak reinforced with steel beams. Under the harsh glare of the articulated surgical lamps, the obsidian drank the light, reflecting nothing. All right, Elias murmured to the machine. Let's see what makes you sleep. He began the ritual. It was a liturgy of disassembly he had performed 1,000 times, though never on a creature such as this. He donned his gloves, white cotton to protect the brass from the acidity of his skin. He selected a screwdriver with a customized head, filing it down slightly to fit the unique gauge of the casing screws. The back panel was heavy, a solid sheet of iron disguised by obsidian veneer. As he turned the first screw, the groan of metal on metal was a shriek in the quiet room. The threads were rusted, seized by decades of oxidation. Elias applied a drop of penetrating oil, waiting, counting the seconds in his head. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. He worked with surgical precision. The back panel came free with a heavy thud, revealing the anatomy of the beast. Elias whistled low. The movement was a masterpiece of over-engineering. The plates were heavy brass, galoche finished with intricate wave patterns. The gear train was massive, the wheels thick and toothed with aggressive precision. But what caught his eye was the mainspring barrels. There were 3 of them. Quarter chimes, he muttered. Westminster? No, Whittington. He leaned in, his loop pressing against his eye socket. The oil in the jeweled bearings had turned to gum, a thick black sludge that acted more like glue than lubricant. Dust, thick and gray, human skin flakes from the 1920s, coated the horizontal surfaces. You're choked, Elias whispered. You're suffocating. He began the extraction. First the pendulum, unhooking the heavy bob. He set it aside. It weighed nearly 10 pounds. Then the hands pulled gently from the cannon pinion. Finally, he unscrewed the movement pillars, isolating the heart of the clock from its stone body. He lifted the mechanism out. It weighed as much as a small engine. He placed it into the cleaning cradle, securing the brass plates. Now came the real work, the dismantling. Elias fell into a trance state. The world outside, the rain, Elena Rosetti, the looming shadow of Victor Sterling, ceased to exist. There was only cause and effect, force and resistance. He cataloged every screw, every washer, placing them in compartmentalized trays. He removed the motion works. He removed the chime hammers. He removed the gathering pallet. He was deep in the gut of the machine when he found the anomaly. It was 2 a.m. His eyes were burning, and his back ached, but his hands were steady. He was working on the escapement, the device that regulates the release of energy, the part that literally creates the tick. On a standard grandfather clock, The escapement is mounted high, near the suspension spring. The anchor rocks back and forth, releasing the escape will one tooth at a time. But this anchor was wrong. Elias paused, his tweezers hovering over the bridge. The brass of the anchor arm was too thick. Not by much, perhaps 2 millimeters, but in horology, 2 millimeters is the distance between continents. It added unnecessary weight, which would throw off the timekeeping unless the weight was a counterbalance. He brought the portable light closer. He examined the side of the brass anchor. There, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a hairline seam. "Hello," Elias whispered. It wasn't a solid casting. It was a locket, a hollowed-out compartment disguised as a structural component. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic tempo that outpaced the wall clocks. This was it. This was what Elena had risked Victor Sterling's wrath for. He needed a finer tool. He reached for a needle probe, a whisper of steel thinner than a human hair. He located the microscopic pinhole release on the underside of the anchor. He pressed. Nothing happened. "Stubborn," he muttered. "Gummed up." He applied a droplet of solvent to the seam, waiting for the chemical to eat through 90 years of grime. He watched the fluid darken as it dissolved the old oil. He pressed again. Click. A sound so faint it was more vibration than noise. The side of the brass anchor popped open like the breech of a shotgun. Elias set the tool down. His hands were shaking now. He took a deep breath, clenched his fists to steady them, and reached in with his tweezers. Inside the hollow cavity was not a jewel or a key or a microfilm. It was a tightly rolled cylinder of paper. It was impossibly small. Elias teased it out, terrified it would crumble into dust. The paper was parchment, high quality, but yellowed and brittle as dead leaves. He placed it on the glass surface of his inspection table. He didn't dare unroll it with his fingers. He used 2 flat-headed probes, gently pinning the edges, coaxing the curl to flatten. The paper resisted, yearning to return to the shape it had held since 1927. But slowly it yielded. The writing was handwritten, in fountain pen. The ink had faded to a sepia brown, but the strokes were aggressive, jagged, written in haste or fury. Elias leaned in, reading the text through the magnification of the lamp. November 14th, 1927. To Archibald Sterling, we have the boy. We have him where the time does not touch. Your precious Obsidian King measures the seconds of your life, but it cannot measure the hours of his suffering. Do not go to the police. Do not speak to your associates. The exchange must happen at the stroke of midnight on the winter solstice. If the clock chimes 13, the boy dies. If the clock stops, the boy dies. The sequence is the key. Reset the moon phase. The ransom is not money, Archibald. The ransom is the Chronos prototype. You have 37 days. The architects. Elias read it twice, then a third time. A chill that had nothing to do with the drafty shop crawled up his spine. The ransom note had never been found. That was the implication. It had been hidden inside the clock. But that didn't make sense. If the kidnappers hid the note inside the clock, how was Archibald Sterling supposed to find it? Unless the clock was the message. Elias looked back at the dismantled movement. The Chronos prototype. He looked at the date. November 1927. The Sterling heir. Elias whispered to the empty room. The boy who went missing. History books, at least the ones horologists read, mention the tragedy of the Sterling family. Archibald Sterling, the railway tycoon and clock collector, had lost his only son in 1927. The boy simply vanished. Archibald had gone mad, spending his fortune on occultists and detectives, eventually dying bankrupt and alone in his manor. The official story was that the boy ran away or was taken by rivals. But this changed everything. If the clock chimes 13, Elias's eyes widened. Clocks don't chime 13. It's mechanically impossible, unless the rack and snail striking mechanism was altered. He grabbed his light and swung it back to the dismantled parts tray. He found the snail, the cam that determines how many times the hammer strikes. It was a stepped spiral, usually with 12 steps. He counted them. 1, 2, 3. He rotated the brass piece under the light. 11. 12. There was a 13th step. A tiny, jagged notch cut into the metal, hidden deep in the curve where the rack arm would only fall if forced. My God! Elias breathed. It wasn't a warning. It was a trigger. The clock had been rigged. If Archibald Sterling had wound the clock, if he had let it run to midnight, the mechanism would have hit that 13th step. And then what?
En explosion?
A signal? Or was the 13th chime a metaphor for something else entirely? Elias felt a sudden, crushing wave of paranoia. He felt exposed. The windows, darkened by the curtains, felt like eyes. He looked back at the note. The ransom is the Kronos prototype. He picked up the tweezers and was about to roll the note back up when he noticed something on the reverse side of the paper. It had soaked through slightly, but there were faint markings on the back. He flipped the paper over with agonizing slowness. It wasn't writing. It was a schematic, a diagram of a gear train, but the geometry was wrong. It was non-Euclidean, spiraling inward in a way that hurt the eyes to follow. At the center of the spiral were coordinates: 51.5074 degrees north, 0.1278 degrees west. London. Elias's mind raced. Elena Rosetti had said Victor Sterling wanted the clock. Victor was Archibald's grandnephew, the current patriarch. If Victor knew about this note, about the prototype, the landline phone on the wall rang. The sound was shockingly loud, a physical blow in the silence. It was an old rotary phone with a mechanical bell that screamed. Elias stared at it. It was 2:45 a.m. Nobody called it 2:45 a.m. He let it ring. Ring, 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 ring. He walked over to it, his boots crunching on the wooden floorboards. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the receiver. The dust motes danced in the lamplight. He picked it up. Thorne. There was silence on the other end. No, not silence. Breathing. Wet, heavy breathing. And in the background, a rhythmic sound. Tick, tock, tick, tock. But it wasn't the fast beat of a watch or the steady swing of a grandfather clock. It was slow, agonizingly slow, like a heartbeat slowing down before death. Mr. Thorne, a voice said. It was smooth, cultured, and wrapped in velvet. It sounded like expensive scotch and cruelty. I believe you have something of mine. Elias gripped the receiver tight. I have many things, Mr. Sterling. You'll have to be more specific. The Obsidian King, Victor Sterling said. I know Miss Rosetti brought it to you. She has a sentimental attachment to family history. I, however, prefer to own the future. It's a restoration job, Elias said, trying to keep his voice flat. Client confidentiality. There is no confidentiality between us, Elias. We are both men of the trade. We know that time is a commodity. Pause. Did you find the anchor? Elias's blood ran cold. He looked at the dismantled escapement on his table, the hollow brass shell lying open like a wound. I don't know what you're talking about, Elias lied. A pity, Sterling sighed. Lying is such a waste of seconds. Listen to me carefully. That clock is not a timepiece. It is a cage. And you are currently unlocking the door to something you do not understand. What is the Kronos prototype? Elias asked, dropping the pretense. The line went silent for a moment. It is the reason my great-uncle died mad. And it is the reason you should put down your tools, walk out of your shop, and leave the door unlocked. My associates are already en route. They will collect the object. If you are not there, you will survive. If you are there, well, accidents happen in workshops. Solvents are so flammable. You're threatening me? I am giving you a forecast, Mr. Thorne. Like the weather. It is raining tonight, and shortly it will be burning. Click. The line went dead. Elias stood there, the receiver humming with the dial tone. He looked at the heavy oak door of his shop. He looked at the Obsidian King, its guts spilled out across his table. My associates are already en route. He had maybe 10 minutes, maybe 5. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to seize him. He wanted to run. He wanted to grab his coat and flee into the rainy London night. But then he looked at the note again. We have the boy. He looked at the schematic. The impossible gears. Elias Thorne was a coward when it came to people. He avoided eye contact, he avoided conflict, he hid behind his loop. But he was not a coward when it came to machines. This clock had been used to destroy a life. It was a crime scene frozen in brass and stone. And Elias hated a broken clock. He grabbed the ransom note and shoved it into the breast pocket of his shirt. He swept the dismantled parts of the movement, the anchor, the snail, the wheels, into a leather satchel. He couldn't take the casing. The obsidian was too heavy. But the soul of the clock? That he could save. He grabbed a heavy wrench from the wall. He went to the front of the shop and flipped the lock on the door. Then he turned off the lights, plunging the shop into darkness, illuminated only by the street lamps filtering through the rain. He sat on his stool in the shadows, the wrench in his right hand, the satchel over his shoulder. The shop ticked around him. 300 clocks, all marking the seconds. Tick, tock. Outside, a black sedan pulled up to the curb, its headlights cutting through the rain. Car doors slammed. Elias checked his own wristwatch. The second hand swept past the 12. Come on then, he whispered to the dark. Let's see whose time runs out first. The morning light did not break so much as it bruised the sky, a tender violet hematite turning into a dull, unrelenting gray over the London skyline. Inside the shop, the air was stale, recycled through lungs and machinery too many times. Elias Thorne had not slept. He sat on his stool, the leather groaning softly under a shift in weight, his eyes red-rimmed and burning. On the workbench, the brass automaton, the device that had arrived in a crate of rain-warped oak, sat motionless. It was no longer humming. The impossible heartbeat that had thrummed through the metal casing the night before had silenced, leaving behind a cold, heavy inertness that felt more like a corpse than a machine. Elias picked up his loop, screwing it into his eye socket. The brass felt greasy, though he had wiped it down with spirits 3 times. He leaned in, focusing on the escapement. It was a tourbillon, but wrong. The cage rotated on a dual axis, a piece of engineering that shouldn't have been possible with modern CNC machines, let alone the hand tools of the 19th century. But it was the engraving that had kept him awake. Hidden beneath the balance wheel, visible only when the mainspring was completely unwound, was a signature. It wasn't a manufacturer's stamp. It was a scratch, desperate and jagged, etched as if by a needle held in a trembling hand.
Hvězdička V. Sterling.
Don't let it ring. Elias pulled back, the loop falling into his palm. The name tasted like old copper. Sterling. It was a name that belonged to the bedrock of the city, synonymous with steel, railways, and the kind of money that bought silence. But V. Sterling? That was a ghost story. He needed more than a loop. He needed a bloodhound. The Blackfriars pub was a subterranean hole in the wall near Fleet Street, the kind of place that smelled of yeast, damp wool, and regret. It was 11 in the morning, which meant the clientele consisted of 3 old men nursing stouts and Elena Rosetti. Elias spotted her in the back booth, a fortress constructed of crumbled napkin balls, a laptop covered in aggressive stickers, and a glass of whiskey that looked dangerously empty. Elena had been the sharpest investigative journalist at the Times until she wasn't. A scandal involving a politician, a fabricated source, and a lawsuit had turned her byline into poison. Now, she wrote listicles for clickbait sites and drank her lunch. "You look like hell, Thorne," she said without looking up from her screen. Her voice was sandpaper over gravel, a smoker's rasp despite the unlit cigarette she twirled between her fingers like a baton. "And you look busy," Elias replied, sliding onto the bench opposite her. He placed a manila envelope on the sticky table. Elena eyed the envelope, then him. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and currently narrowed in suspicion. If that's a bill for the watch repair, I'm good for it. Next week. It's not a bill. It's a job. She snorted, finally looking at him. I don't fix clocks, Elias. I break stories. Or, more accurately these days, I write top 10 ways to tell your cat is plotting your murder. I need you to find someone, or rather, find out what happened to someone. I'm not a private eye. You're the only person I know who can navigate the city archives without getting banned for arguing with the librarians. And you know the Sterling family history.
Elena Rosetti.
The cigarette stopped twirling. The cynicism that coated her like armor seemed to crack. Just a hairline fracture. Sterling? Which one? The senator? The lush of a grandson? Victor, Elias said softly. Elena stared at him for a long, stretched moment. She closed her laptop with a decisive snap. Victor Sterling hasn't existed for 100 years, Elias. He's the boogeyman of the industrial age. The boy who walked into time. I have a clock, Elias whispered, leaning in. The ambient noise of the pub, the clinking glasses, the low murmur of the old men, seemed to fade. It has his name inside, scratched by hand. Dated 1924. Elena's expression shifted from dismissal to a predatory focus. It was the look of an addict being offered a fix. She reached out and tapped the envelope. Show me. Elias opened it, sliding out a high-resolution macro photograph he'd taken at dawn. The jagged scratch on the brass was clear.
Hvězdička V. Sterling.
Don't let it ring. Elena traced the letters with a chipped fingernail. Do you know the story, Elias? The real one, not the sanitized Wikipedia entry. I know he disappeared on New Year's Eve. He didn't just disappear, Elena said, her voice dropping to a hush. He was the heir to the Sterling Steel Empire, but he hated the mills. He was obsessed with horology, not just keeping time but controlling it. He built a workshop in the attic of the family estate in Highgate, locked himself in for 3 years. The servants said they could hear grinding and humming at all hours. They said the air in the house tasted like tin. She took a sip of her whiskey, grimacing. New Year's Eve, 1924. The family throws a massive gala. Victor is supposed to come down at midnight to unveil his masterpiece. Midnight strikes. No, Victor. The father breaks down the attic door. The room is empty. Windows sealed. Chimney bricked up. Door locked from the inside. Victor Sterling was gone. The only thing left was a space on the workbench where a clock should have been. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp pub. And the family? Buried it. Paid off the police, paid off the press. Victor was declared legally dead 7 years later. The estate has been rotting in probate limbo ever since. The last caretaker died in the 80s. I need to see that workshop, Elias said. Elena laughed. A harsh, barking sound. Of course you do. And I suppose you think I can just waltz us into a condemned, high-security ruin owned by a litigious trust fund? I think, Elias said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a heavy, iron key he had found taped to the bottom of the crate, that we don't need to break in. Elena looked at the key. It was ornate, the bow shaped like an hourglass. She looked back at Elias, a slow, terrifying grin spreading across her face. Thorne, she said, grabbing her coat. You finally got interesting. The Sterling estate was a scar on the landscape of Highgate, surrounded by a wrought iron fence that had been swallowed by ivy and brambles. The house loomed like a thunderhead made of stone. It was Victorian Gothic, all jagged spires and gargoyles that seemed to be eroding into scream masks under the assault of a century of rain. The Uber driver refused to go up the driveway, leaving them at the rusted gates. The rain had returned, a fine, misty drizzle that clung to Elias's eyelashes. Charming, Elena muttered, pulling her collar up. If I die here, I want you to know I'm haunting your toaster. Elias didn't answer. He was too busy looking at the house. He felt a magnetic pull, a physical sensation in his chest that mirrored the vibration he had felt from the clock. The closer they got, the louder the silence became. It was a heavy silence, pressurized, like the air inside a diving bell. They navigated the overgrown driveway, stepping over fallen branches that snapped like dry bones. The front door was massive, oak reinforced with iron bands. There was no keyhole for the iron key Elias held. Service entrance, Elena suggested, pointing toward the side of the house where a trellis had collapsed under the weight of dead wisteria. They picked their way through the debris to a smaller door. Elias tried the key. It slid in with a satisfying, oily shick. He turned it. The tumblers fell with a heavy clunk that echoed through the wood, and the door creaked open. The smell hit them first. It wasn't the smell of rot, as Elias had expected. It was the smell of a library. Dust, dry paper, and beeswax, preserved in a vacuum. They stepped into a scullery. Pans still hung from hooks, coated in gray dust thick as velvet. Flashlights, Elena whispered, clicking hers on. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a hallway that stretched into the dark belly of the house. The workshop was in the attic, Elena said. Top floor, east wing. They moved through the house like intruders in a mausoleum. They passed a grand ballroom where furniture stood draped in white sheets, looking like a congregation of ghosts. A grand piano sat in the corner, silent. Elias paused, shining his light on a grandfather clock in the hallway. The pendulum was still. The hands were frozen at 11:59. Every clock in the house, Elias murmured, shining his light on a mantel clock in the next room. They're all stopped at the same time. Midnight, Elena said. Dramatic. No, Elias corrected, leaning closer to the face of a wall regulator. Look at the second hand. It's not midnight exactly. It's missing. What? The second hand. It's gone. And on the grandfather clock too. Elena shone her light around. Maybe scavengers? Who steals just the second hands? Elias shook his head, the unease in his gut twisting tighter. Let's get to the attic. The stairs were wide and treacherous, the carpet runner slick with dust. As they ascended, the air grew colder. By the time they reached the third-floor landing, they could see their breath in the flashlight beams. At the end of the corridor stood a door unlike the others. It was metal, copper mostly, turning green with verdigris. It looked like the door to a bank vault or a submarine. Victor's lab, Elena said, her voice devoid of its usual sarcasm. She sounded reverent. There was no keyhole here either. Instead, there was a dial, a combination lock. Damn it, Elena hissed. I don't suppose your magic box came with a code? Elias stared at the dial. It was etched with zodiac symbols instead of numbers. He thought of the clock back in his shop, the complex gearing, the specific alignment of the planetary complication he had noted but not understood. It's not a code, Elias said, his mind racing through the gear ratios he had memorized. It's a date, the alignment of the stars on the night he vanished. New Year's Eve, 1924, Elena supplied. Elias gripped the cold metal of the dial. He turned it, Capricorn, then the position of Saturn, then Mars. He worked by feel, sensing the tiny clicks within the mechanism that his fingers were trained to detect. It was a masterwork of lockpicking, but he wasn't picking it, he was communicating with it. The lock spoke the language of time, and Elias was a native speaker. Asterisk click. The heavy bolts retracted with a groan that vibrated through the floorboards. The door swung inward. They stepped inside. The room was vast, dominated by a sloping glass skylight that was now black with grime, blocking out the sky. The walls were lined with chalkboards covered in frantic scribblings, mathematical equations, geometric diagrams, and sketches of gears that looked like fractals. In the center of the room was a workbench. It was exactly as Elena had described the legend. Tools were scattered as if dropped mid-use. A half-drunk cup of tea, now just a stain of mold in a china cup. And in the center of the bench, a clean, dust-free square where something had once sat. The clock, Elias breathed. My clock sat there. Elena was prowling the perimeter, her camera clicking rapidly. Elias, look at the walls. He turned his light to the chalkboards. The equations weren't just math. They were frantic repetitions. Asterisk time is not a river. Time is a frequency. Asterisk asterisk the brass captures the resonance. Asterisk asterisk I can hear them scratching at the other side. Crazy genius, Elena muttered, photographing a diagram that looked disturbingly like a human heart made of gears. Standard operating procedure for the 1920s. Elias moved to the desk. He felt drawn to the empty space. He ran a gloved hand over the wood. It was warm. Elena, he said, his voice trembling. The wood is warm. Don't be stupid. It's freezing in here. Come here. Feel it. She walked over, hesitant. She stripped off a glove and touched the spot. She snatched her hand back as if burned. What the hell? Vibrating. Resonance, Elias whispered. The clock is linked to this place. Quantum entanglement? Sympathetic magic? I don't know. He looked around the desk. Tucked under a pile of schematics was a leather-bound journal. He pulled it out. The leather was brittle, cracking in his hands. He opened it to the last entry. Asterisk December 31st, 1924. Asterisk the ransom is ready. I understand now what the toll is. They do not want gold. They do not want power. The keepers of the threshold require a life to bridge the gap. I thought I could build a key to open the door and look inside. But the door swings both ways. If I activate the Chronos engine tonight, I am not opening a door. I am inviting them in. Asterisk I have to dismantle it. I have to scatter the pieces. But the mainspring is already wound. Cannot be stopped. If I cannot stop the time, I must remove the timekeeper. Asterisk I am the ransom. Elias read the words aloud. The silence in the room seemed to deepen, pressing against his eardrums. The Chronos engine, Elena said. That's the clock you have. And he didn't dismantle it, Elias said. He vanished. I must remove the timekeeper. Suddenly, a sound cut through the stillness. Asterisk tick. Came from the corner of the room. Asterisk talk. Elias and Elena spun around, flashlights sweeping the shadows. In the far corner, covered by a tarp, stood a massive shape. Asterisk tick. The sound was wet, heavy, not metal on metal. Elias, Elena said, backing away. We should go. I have to see, Elias said. He couldn't stop himself. The curiosity that defined his life, the obsession with the mechanism, pulled him forward. He approached the tarp. He grabbed the corner and pulled. Dust billowed. Beneath the tarp was a mirror. A massive, floor-length cheval mirror in a heavy brass frame. But the glass wasn't reflecting the room. The surface of the mirror was rippling like a dark pond disturbed by a stone. And in the center of the black, swirling glass, a shape was forming. A silhouette of a man in a frock coat, his face obscured by the digital distortion of reality. And then the sound changed. It wasn't ticking anymore. It was knocking. From inside the mirror. Asterisk knock. 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 Help me. a voice whispered. It didn't come from the mirror. It came from Elias's pocket, from the phone he had silenced. But the phone wasn't ringing. The voice was vibrating through his very bones. Elias! Elena grabbed his arm, her grip bruising. Run! The glass of the mirror bowed outward, stretching like a bubble. A hand, pale, long-fingered, and translucent, pressed against the surface from the inside, desperate to break through. Elias stared at the hand. On the ring finger was a signet ring, the sterling crest. Victor, Elias breathed. The mirror shattered, but it didn't break into shards of glass. It exploded into a cloud of black vapor that screamed. The sound was a cacophony of 1,000 ticking clocks accelerating into a shriek. The force of it threw Elias and Elena backward. Go! Elena yelled, scrambling to her feet. She dragged Elias up. They ran. They sprinted out of the workshop, down the freezing corridor, the sound of the screaming vapor chasing them. It sounded like a swarm of locusts, mechanical and hungry. They took the stairs 2 at a time, risking broken necks in the dark. Elias could feel the temperature dropping rapidly behind them, frost blooming on the walls as the entity passed. They burst through the service door and into the rain, the cold wetness hitting them like a blessing. They didn't stop running until they reached the rusted gates, gasping for air, their lungs burning. Elias bent over, hands on his knees, dry heaving. Elena was leaning against a stone pillar, shaking, her lighter flickering uselessly in her hand as she tried to spark a flame. What? Elias gasped. What was that? Elena finally got the flame to catch. She didn't light a cigarette. She just stared at the fire, as if reassuring herself that the world was still physical, still real. That, she said, her voice trembling, was the story of the century. She looked at Elias, her face pale in the streetlight. He's not dead, Elias. Victor Sterling isn't dead. He's stuck. He's stuck in the frequency. Elias reached into his jacket pocket to check his phone, to ground himself in technology. His hand brushed against the leather journal he had instinctively shoved into his coat before running. He pulled it out. The rain splattered onto the cover. He opened it to the first page. There, tucked into the binding, was a photograph. It was old, sepia-toned. It showed a young Victor Sterling standing next to a severe-looking man with a white beard. They were standing in front of the very workshop they had just fled. But it was the man with the beard that made Elias's blood turn to ice. He wore a distinctive lapel pin, a gear with a dagger through it. Elias had seen that symbol before, not in a history book, not in a museum. He had seen it yesterday, on the business card of the man who had delivered the crate. The man who had smiled with too many teeth and said, "Asterisk time is a gift, Mr. Thorne. Don't waste it." "Elena," Elias said, holding up the photo, "we're not just looking for a lost heir." Elena looked at the symbol. "What is it?" "We're in a race," Elias said, looking back at the dark, looming silhouette of the Sterling house. The screaming had stopped, but the sense of being watched was stronger than ever. "And I think the other runners have a 100-year head start." "Where to?" Elena asked, no longer arguing, no longer cynical. She was terrified, and she was all in. Elias clutched the journal to his chest. "Back to the shop. The clock isn't just a machine. It's an anchor. If Victor is stuck, the clock is the rope." He looked at her, his eyes hard. "We're going to pull him out." Above them, on the highest peak of the Sterling roof, a single crow watched them. Its head twitched with mechanical precision. It opened its beak, and the sound that came out was not a caw. It was the chime of a clock striking one. The fog in Ethelgard did not roll in. It descended, heavy and suffocating, like a damp wool blanket thrown over a birdcage. It muted the clatter of carriage wheels on the cobblestones and turned the gas lamps of High Street into weeping, haloed eyes staring blindly into the gloom. Elias Thorne walked with his head down, collar turned up against the biting chill of the river damp. His right hand remained buried deep in his coat pocket, fingers curled tight around the cold brass casing of the pocket watch he had repaired earlier that day. A simple job, a regulator adjustment, but the tactile familiarity of the metal grounded him. It was a tether to reality in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. Since discovering the parchment hidden within the chassis of the heartbeat automaton 2 nights ago, Elias had felt a phantom tick behind his eyes, a rhythmic pressure that warned of time running out. The city, usually a symphony of steam whistles and distant factory thrumming, now felt predatory. Shadows stretched too long. Footsteps echoed with a cadence that didn't match his own. He turned off the main thoroughfare, slipping into the labyrinthine embrace of the artisan's quarter. Here, the air tasted of coal dust, ozone, and the distinct, acrid tang of hot copper. It was the smell of home. Elias paused at the corner of Blackwood Lane, listening. The silence was absolute, save for the dripping of condensation from the eaves. He told himself he was being paranoid. He told himself that finding a cipher written in his dead father's hand inside a machine built by a stranger was a coincidence, a ghost in the gears. But Elias Thorne was a man who dealt in precision, in the mathematical certainty of cause and effect. Coincidences were merely variables he hadn't yet calculated. He reached the heavy oak door of his workshop, Thorne and Son, Horology and Mechanisms. The brass nameplate was tarnished, the and Son barely legible under years of grime. He fished for his keys, the iron ring cold against his palm. He stopped. The keyhole was scratched. It was a minute detail, one that anyone else would have missed. But Elias knew every groove, every imperfection of his sanctuary. Fresh silver scars marred the dull iron surrounding the lock, gleaming faintly in the diffused street lamp light. The tumblers were not aligned. The mechanism had been forced, but with skill, a tension wrench and a rake likely. Elias didn't breathe. He didn't move. He simply stood there, the fog curling around his ankles, staring at the violation of his threshold. The dread that had been a low hum in his gut for 48 hours suddenly roared into a deafening crescendo. He pushed the door. It swung inward with a groan that sounded like a dying animal. The smell hit him first. Usually, the workshop smelled of cedar, linseed oil, and old paper. Now it smelled of violence. It smelled of shattered glass and spilled solvents, a sharp, chemical sting that burned the back of his throat. Elias stepped inside, his hand fumbling for the switch of the electric arc lamp near the door. The filament buzzed, flickered, and then bathed the room in a harsh, clinical white light. His knees nearly gave way. It was a graveyard of gears. The workshop, his meticulously organized kingdom of order, had been eviscerated. The long workbenches were overturned. Drawers had been pulled out and dumped, creating a chaotic sea of springs, screws, and escapements across the floor. It looked as though a whirlwind composed entirely of malice had torn through the room. "No!" he whispered, the word fragile. He stepped over a shattered cabinet, the crunch of glass under his boot sounding like a gunshot. To his left, the display case that held his collection of antique astrolabes was smashed. The delicate brass instruments bent and twisted, stomped upon by heavy boots. They hadn't just searched, they had punished. Elias moved deeper into the room, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He scanned the wreckage, his mind racing to catalog the damage, to find the logic in the destruction. They had torn apart the upholstery of his reading chair. They had ripped the schematics from the walls, leaving shreds of blue paper hanging like flayed skin. But as he looked, a pattern emerged from the chaos. The cash box under the counter was untouched. The silver ingots he used for plating, sitting openly on the soldering shelf, were still there. The expensive German lathe was overturned but not stolen. This wasn't a robbery. It was a hunt. The Valesneria, he gasped, the thought seizing him. He scrambled over the debris, ignoring the sharp bite of a mainspring slicing through his trouser leg. He rushed to the back of the shop, toward the heavy iron alcove where the main steam pipes entered the building. There, mounted on the wall, was the Valesneria chronometer. It was his masterpiece, a clock designed to look like a tangle of aquatic vines, powered by water displacement rather than springs. It was ugly, bulky, and hissed rhythmically. It was also the one thing in the shop that looked more like plumbing than a treasure. The intruders had ignored it. To the untrained eye, it was just a mess of pipes and pressure gauges. Elias's trembling hands flew over the cold copper vines. He found the hidden pressure release valve behind the third leaf and twisted it counterclockwise. With a hiss of steam, a small compartment in the base of the clock popped open. He reached in. His fingers brushed against velvet. He pulled out the small, leather-bound pouch. He didn't open it. The weight was enough. The cipher, the note found in the brass heartbeat, was safe. He slumped against the wall, clutching the pouch to his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. They hadn't found it. They had destroyed his life's work, desecrated his sanctuary, but they had failed. You should really invest in a better lock, Elias. The voice came from the shadows near the entrance, smooth, smoky, and laced with a terrifying calmness. Elias spun around, slipping the pouch into his inner vest pocket in one fluid motion. He grabbed a heavy wrench from the floor, holding it like a club. A figure detached itself from the gloom of the doorway. Elena Rosetti stepped into the light. She looked as out of place as a diamond in a coal chute. Her trench coat was tailored, her boots polished, and her dark hair was pinned back severely, revealing a face that was striking not for its beauty, but for its intelligence. Her eyes, the color of stormy seas, swept over the wreckage. "Elena," Elias breathed, lowering the wrench but not dropping it. "You scared the hell out of me. Someone else got here first, I see," she said, stepping gingerly over a pile of mangled clock hands. She didn't look frightened. She looked angry. A cold, professional fury tightened her jaw. "They missed what they were looking for," Elias said, his voice hoarse. "Are you sure?" Elena stopped in the center of the room, picking up a twisted gyroscope. She examined it for a moment, then tossed it aside. "Because this doesn't look like a failed burglary. This looks like a message. They didn't take the silver. They didn't take the cash." "Of course they didn't," Elena snapped, her gaze snapping to his. "You think Victor Sterling needs your petty cash? He spends more on his cigars than your entire inventory is worth." The name hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Asterisk Victor Sterling. Asterisk the industrialist. The man who owned half the foundries in Ethelgard and had his hands in the pockets of the other half. Sterling? Elias shook his head. "The note," Elias whispered. "You think he knows about the note?" "Elias, look around you." She gestured widely at the devastation. "This isn't random. Sterling's men, the Iron Jackals, this is their signature. They break what they can't understand. They wanted to terrorize you. They wanted you to know that nowhere is safe." She reached out, her fingers hovering over a smashed photograph of Elias and his father. Her expression softened, just for a fraction of a second. "He's escalating. The disappearances, the strange signals from the Western District, and now this. He's looking for the machine your father was working on before he vanished." and he thinks you're holding out on him." Elias looked at the photograph. The glass was spiderwebbed over his father's smiling face. A cold rage began to solidify in his chest, displacing the fear. "I don't have the machine," Elias said, his voice steadying. "I just have a riddle that leads to the machine," Elena corrected. "And right now you are the only one who can solve it, which makes you the most valuable and most endangered man in the city." Before Elias could respond, the sound of a cane tapping against the floorboards echoed from the open door.
Asterisk top. Top. Top.
It was a slow, deliberate sound, rhythmic, arrogant. Elias and Elena froze. They turned toward the entrance together. Standing there, framed by the swirling fog, was a man of immense stature. He wore a charcoal suit cut from the finest wool, a silk cravat, and a heavy overcoat draped over his shoulders like a cape. His face was a mask of patrician indifference, sporting a mustache waxed to razor points. In his gloved hand, he held a cane topped with a silver skull. Victor Sterling. He didn't come with an army. He didn't need to. He filled the doorway with his presence alone. Behind him, in the street, two hulking shapes. His personal guards loomed in the mist, arms crossed, their eyes glowing with the faint red luminescence of ocular implants. "Good evening, Mr. Thorne," Sterling said. His voice was a rich baritone, warm and resonant, entirely at odds with the destruction surrounding him. "I see you've had a spot of trouble with the local ruffians. Dreadful times we live in. Dreadful." Elias gripped the wrench so hard his knuckles turned white. "Get out." Sterling smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Is that any way to treat a potential patron? I heard a rumor of a break-in. Being a concerned citizen and a lover of the mechanical arts, I thought I would stop by to offer my resources." He stepped into the shop, the crunch of glass under his polished Oxfords sounding obscenely loud. He ignored Elena entirely, his eyes locked on Elias. "I don't want your help," Elias spat. "And I don't want your resources. I know who did this. Do you?" Sterling stopped at a workbench, running a gloved finger through a spill of oil. He examined the black stain with mock fascination. "Accusations are dangerous things, Mr. Thorne. Almost as dangerous as hoarding secrets." "I have nothing for you," Elias said. Sterling looked up, his gaze boring into Elias. "We all have something, Elias. Your father. He had vision, a rare commodity. It would be a tragedy if his legacy were to be lost under a pile of refuse." He gestured lazily at the destroyed workshop. Elena stepped forward, positioning herself slightly in front of Elias. "Cut the theatrics, Victor. You tossed the place. You didn't find it. Now you're here to see if he cracks." Sterling finally acknowledged her, turning his head slowly. "Miss Rosetti, the Gazette's crusader. I should have known I'd find you here, sniffing around like a stray dog at a butcher's back door. Still chasing ghosts? Better than creating them," she shot back. Sterling chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "Vit, how charming, and how utterly useless." He turned back to Elias, his demeanor shifting. The veneer of politeness thinned, revealing the steel beneath. He walked closer, invading Elias's personal space. Elias could smell him, sandalwood, expensive tobacco, and something metallic like charged air. "Listen to me, boy," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. "Progress is a locomotive. It does not stop for sentiment. It does not stop for grief. Crushes anything on the tracks." He leaned in, his eyes searching Elias's face, looking for a twitch, a tell. "There is a rumor of a key, a cipher, something old Jacob left behind. If you have it, you will bring it to me. Not because I ask, but because the alternative is untidy. Elias felt the weight of the pouch in his pocket. Felt like it was burning a hole through his vest. He forced himself to hold Sterling's gaze. My father left me nothing but debt and a shop full of broken clocks. If you think there's a magical key, you're chasing a fairy tale. Sterling stared at him for He's playing with you, Elena said, turning back. Her face was pale. He came here to gauge your reaction. If he was sure you had it, you'd be in the back of a carriage right now with a bag over your head. He'll be back. Yes, he will. Elena walked over to Elias, grabbing him by the shoulders. Which means you can't be here when he returns. This shop is burned, Elias. You can't stay here. Elias looked around the room again. This was his life. Every tool had a memory attached to it. The lathe he'd bought with his first big commission. The workbench his father had built. Leaving felt like an amputation. Where do I go? He asked, feeling small. The underground, Elena said. I have a safe house in the filtration tunnels under the river. It's damp, it smells like algae, and the rats are the size of cats. But Sterling's ocular drones can't scan through the lead piping. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out the pouch. He undid the strings and tipped the contents into his hand. It wasn't just a note. It was a small, perforated brass card, punched with holes in a complex, non-linear pattern. And wrapped around it was a scrap of parchment with a single line of text in his father's handwriting. Time is not a river. It is a cage. The key lies in the echo. The echo? Elias muttered, running his thumb over the brass card. What does it mean? Elena asked, looking over his shoulder. I don't know, Elias admitted. He looked up at the smashed astrolabes, the ruined clocks, the debris of his existence. But Sterling thinks it leads to a weapon. My father. He thought it led to freedom. And what do you think? Elias clenched his fist around the brass card. The metal bit into his skin. He looked at the Valesneria, ticking away peacefully in the corner, oblivious to the destruction. I think, Elias said, a new hardness entering his voice, that I am going to find out why my father died, and I think I'm going to make Victor Sterling regret breaking my door. He moved to the back of the shop, grabbing a heavy canvas rucksack. He didn't pack clothes. He packed precision screwdrivers, a set of lockpicks, a portable soldering iron, and a modified repeating crossbow he kept for unruly customers. We need to move, Elias said, swinging the bag over his shoulder. If Sterling is watching the front, there will be others at the back. The coal chute? Elena suggested. The coal chute. Elias agreed. He took one last look at the workshop. He mentally said goodbye to the smell of cedar and oil. When he returned, if he returned, he would not be the same man. The clockmaker was gone. The fugitive had begun. Elias extinguished the arc lamp, plunging the room back into darkness. Lead the way, he said. They moved through the shadows of the workshop, stepping over the wreckage of the past, and slipped into the black maw of the cellar, descending into the underbelly of Ethelgard just as the heavy oak door upstairs began to splinter under the force of a battering ram. Sterling hadn't left. He had just stepped back to let the professionals finish the job. But as the iron jackals burst into the room, their red eyes scanning the gloom, they found nothing but ticking clocks and silence. The bird had flown, and he had taken the heartbeat of the mystery with him. Down in the tunnels, the dripping water echoed like the ticking of a vast, infernal clock. Tick. Tock. The game had truly begun. The silence in the workshop was not empty. It was heavy, textured with the scent of ozone and the relentless, syncopated heartbeat of 1,000 clocks. Rain lashed against the high, grime-streaked windows of the loft, blurring the neon glow of the city outside into bruised smears of violet and amber. But inside, under the singular, harsh cone of the articulated desk lamp, the world had shrunk to the dimensions of a single sheet of parchment and a machine that defied the laws of geometry. Elias Thorne stood over the workbench, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the mahogany table. His breathing was shallow, a sharp counterpoint to the rhythmic ticking that filled the room. Across from him, Elena Rosetti paced the perimeter of the light, her hand hovering perpetually near the holster beneath her coat. She was a coiled spring, kinetic energy waiting for release, whereas Elias was the static load, bearing the crushing weight of the impossible. "It doesn't make sense," Elias whispered, his voice raspy. He pushed his magnification loupe up onto his forehead, rubbing eyes that felt like they were filled with grit. "The ransom note. It's gibberish, Elena. At the stroke of the impossible hour, the shadow falls upward. It's poetry. Bad poetry. It's not a location." Elena stopped pacing. She moved into the light, her features sharp and cast in high relief. She snatched the parchment from the table, her eyes scanning the jagged, handwritten scrawl for the 100th time. "Sterling doesn't write poetry, Elias. He writes demands," she said, her voice tight. "He has your father. He gave us 6 hours. We have 2 left. If this is a riddle, you need to solve it, and you need to solve it now. You're the horologist. You're the prodigy. Think." Elias looked away from the paper and toward the object that sat in the center of the workbench. The chronos. It was a clock, yet to call it a clock was like calling a cathedral a hut. It was a chaotic, beautiful sphere of brass, copper, and tempered glass, roughly the size of a human skull. Inside, the gear train didn't merely rotate on a flat plane. It tumbled in 3 dimensions, a gyroscopic nightmare of interlocking teeth and springs. It was the device his father had vanished to protect, the device Victor Sterling was tearing the city apart to find. And now it sat inert, a cold lump of metal. "The note isn't the message," Elias murmured, a thought striking him like the chime of a bell. He reached out, his long, oil-stained fingers hovering over the chronos. "The note is the combination." He grabbed the parchment from Elena, ignoring her protest, and held it up to the light. He wasn't reading the words anymore. He was looking at the structure. The ink was uneven. Certain loops in the letters were thicker, pressed harder. "Look," Elias said, pointing to the letter O in the word hour. "And here the S in shadow. The curvature. It's not handwriting. It's a schematic." Elena leaned in, squinting. "I see ink on paper, Elias. Don't hallucinate. No, look at the angles. The slant of the T. That's a 20-degree inclination. The loop of the O isn't round. It's elliptical, matching the ratio of a fusee gear." Elias's mind, usually a chaotic storm of anxiety, suddenly crystallized. The world slowed down. He didn't see a ransom note. He saw a blueprint overlaying the text. "Sterling didn't write this. My father did. He was forced to write it, but he encoded the instructions in the penmanship. He knew I'd see it. He knew only I would see it." "Instructions for what?" "For the chronos," Elias said, turning back to the machine. "The ransom drop isn't in the note. The map is inside the clock." He sat down, the stool creaking beneath him. He pulled a set of microcalipers and a torque key from his vest pocket. The air in the room seemed to drop a few degrees, the shadows stretching longer as the thunder rattled the window panes. "The gear train cipher," Elias breathed. "It's an old myth among the guild, a way of locking information not in a safe, but in the alignment of time itself. You have to set the clock to a time that doesn't exist to unlock the chamber." A time that doesn't exist? Elena asked, checking her watch. Elias, we are running out of the real kind. Quiet, please. I need to listen to the escapement. Elias inserted the torque key into the primary winding arbor of the Chronos. The metal was cold, unforgiving. He applied a fraction of a newton of force. The machine groaned, a sound like a dying violin. He closed his eyes. He didn't need to see the gears. He needed to feel them through the steel of the key. He visualized the interior. The mainspring coiling like a serpent, the escapement lever rocking back and forth, the balance wheel oscillating. Asterisk the slant of the T. 20 degrees. Elias rotated the outer ring of the gyroscope 20 degrees counterclockwise. A series of clicks, rapid and sharp like gunfire, echoed from within the brass sphere. Asterisk the elliptical O. He adjusted the equatorial ring, tilting the axis of the internal mechanism. The gears ground against each other. A sickening sound of metal on metal that made Elena wince, but Elias pushed through. He felt a catch, a sweet spot where the tension suddenly vanished. He's coming, Elena said suddenly, her voice dropping to a whisper. Elias's eyes snapped open. Who? Sterling. I feel it. As if summoned by her intuition, the heavy iron door of the workshop, 3 flights down, slammed shut. The reverberation traveled up the beams of the warehouse. Footsteps followed, slow, deliberate, heavy. Not the frantic pace of the police, nor the stealth of a thief. These were the footsteps of ownership. He wasn't waiting for the drop, Elena hissed, drawing her weapon. She killed the main lights, plunging the workshop into a gloom illuminated only by the desk lamp and the lightning flashes. He tracked the device. He knew you'd bring it here to open it. I need time, Elias snapped, his hands shaking slightly as he went back to the key. I can't stop now. If I release the tension, the safety catch will engage and shear the main gear. The map will be destroyed. Keep working, Elena commanded, moving into the shadows behind a stack of crate-sized grandfather clock cases. I'll buy you your time. The footsteps reached the landing. The door to the loft creaked open. Victor Sterling stepped into the pool of light. He was a man who wore his wealth like armor. His charcoal overcoat was dry despite the storm, his silver-tipped cane tapping rhythmically against the floorboards. He was flanked by 2 men, hulking shapes in the darkness that looked more like industrial machinery than human beings. Sterling didn't look at Elena's hiding spot. He looked only at Elias and the brass sphere in his hands. Elias, Sterling purred, his voice smooth and rich, like brandy poured over gravel. I see you found the key. Your father always did brag about your intuition. It was his only tedious quality. Elias didn't look up. He couldn't. He was holding the torque key in a death grip, maintaining the precise alignment of the gears. Where is he, Sterling? Safe. For the moment, Sterling said, walking closer. He stopped just at the edge of the workbench. The smell of expensive cologne and stale tobacco washed over Elias, overpowering the scent of oil. But patience is a currency, my boy, and I am currently overdrawn. You have the Chronos. You are unlocking the path to the ether drive. I suggest you finish what you started, but do it for me. It's not just a map, Elias gritted out, twisting the key another millimeter. Sweat beaded on his forehead. It's a cipher. If I force it, the mechanism shatters. Then don't force it, Sterling said softly. He raised his cane and rested the silver tip gently on Elias's shoulder. It was a touch that promised violence. But if you don't open it in the next 2 minutes, I will have my associates dismantle your father, piece by piece, starting with his hands. I assume, as a craftsman, you appreciate the tragedy of that? From the shadows, the click of a hammer cocking back was deafeningly loud. Elena stepped out, her revolver leveled at Sterling's chest. "Step away from the bench, Victor," she warned. Sterling didn't flinch. He didn't even turn his head. "Ah, Miss Rosetti, I wondered when you'd join us. Please shoot. My men will cut Elias in half before your casing hits the floor. And then the map is lost forever and we all lose. Is that what you want?" The standoff hung in the air, vibrating with tension. Elias felt the weight of Sterling's cane on his shoulder, the weight of the task in his hands, and the weight of his father's life in the balance. He had to finish it, but he couldn't give it to Sterling. He looked down at the chronos. The gears were aligned. He needed the final trigger. The note said, asterisk at the stroke of the impossible hour. What was the impossible hour? Elias looked at the face of the chronos. It had 3 hands, hour, minute, and a third, jagged hand of blued steel that tracked celestial declination. Asterisk the impossible hour. On a standard clock, the hands overlap at 12 o'clock. But the chronos was designed to track the time of the ether, a theoretical dimension his father had been obsessed with. In that dimension, time didn't cycle. It spiraled. Elias saw the numbers on the ransom note again in his mind's eye. They weren't just degrees. They were the sequence of the prime gears. "Elias," Sterling warned, pressing the cane harder. "Tick-tock. I've got it," Elias gasped. He didn't set the time to 12 o'clock. He grabbed the outer ring and spun the entire face of the clock upside down, reversing gravity's pull on the escapement. Then he forced the jagged celestial hand backward, against the grain of time. The resistance was immense. The metal screamed. "What are you doing?" Sterling shouted, losing his composure for the first time. "You'll break it. The impossible hour." Elias yelled over the grinding noise. Time flowing in reverse. He slammed the hand into the 6 o'clock position, but inverted. Asterisk click. The sound was small, absolute, and final. The screaming of the metal stopped. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The rain battered the roof. Sterling stared at the device, his mouth slightly open. Then the chronos began to hum. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was a resonance, a vibration that rattled the teeth of everyone in the room. The brass plates of the sphere began to shift, sliding over one another like tectonic plates. The gaps between the gears glowed with a fierce, actinic blue light. "Beautiful," Sterling whispered, reaching out. "Get down," Elias screamed, shoving the chronos away from himself and ducking under the heavy oak workbench. Elena didn't hesitate. She dove behind a lathe just as the chronos erupted. It wasn't an explosion of fire, but of light. Beams of intense, focused luminance shot out from the core of the device, piercing the gloom of the workshop. They struck the dust motes in the air, illuminating them until the entire room became a 3-dimensional hologram. The walls of the workshop dissolved in the glare. In their place, a city of light materialized in the air, a phantom map projected by the internal lenses of the clock. It was London, but not the London outside the window. It was a London of tunnels, of subterranean aqueducts and forgotten chambers. And there, pulsing in the center of the projection, directly beneath the foundations of the Blackfriars Bridge, was a red star. "The aqueduct," Elias breathed from beneath the table. He hid the drive in the old Roman aqueduct. Sterling stood amidst the hologram, bathed in the blue light, a look of triumphant ecstasy on his face. He ignored the blinding intensity. He was memorizing the location. "Blackfriars," he laughed. "Of course. The drowned city." He looked down at Elias, his eyes manic. "Thank you, Elias. You've been most helpful." Sterling gestured to his men. "Kill them, Burn the workshop. I have what I need. Now, Elena, Elias shouted, kicking the leg of the workbench. He didn't kick it to attack. He kicked a lever he had installed months ago. A desperate contingency for a workshop prone to chemical fires. A hiss of compressed air shrieked through the room. Overhead, the emergency fire suppression system detonated, but not with water. Elias worked with sensitive electronics. Water was the enemy. The system dumped a massive cloud of halon gas and white suppression powder into the room. The world instantly turned into a blinding white fog. The hologram was extinguished as the light was scattered by the thick powder. "I can't see," one of Sterling's men roared. Gunfire erupted, blind, panicked shots tearing through the wood of the loft. Elias scrambled on his hands and knees, choking on the powder, feeling his way across the floorboards he knew by heart. He felt a hand grab his collar. "Elena, move," she coughed, hauling him up. They ran blindly, guided only by Elena's memory and the layout of the shop. Bullets whizzed past them, shattering jars of screws and clock faces. They crashed through the rear door onto the fire escape, the cool, wet air of the storm hitting them like a physical blow. They tumbled down the iron stairs, the metal slippery with rain, the roar of the city swallowing the chaos above. At the bottom of the alley, leaning against the brickwork, gasping for air, Elias looked up. The window of his workshop was glowing white from the chemical fog, silhouetted against the dark sky. He saw the map, Elias wheezed, wiping the white powder from his face. "Sterling knows where it is." Elena checked the cylinder of her revolver, snapping it shut. Her face was grim, streaked with rain and grime. "He knows where it is," she agreed. "But we know the layout, and we have a head start. My father is likely at the location," Elena said. "Sterling wouldn't keep him far from the prize. We go to Blackfriars tonight." Elias looked at his hands. They were trembling, stained with oil and the white dust of the suppression system. He had solved the gear train cipher. He had proven his genius. And in doing so, he had wound the mainspring of a confrontation that would likely end in death. "The clock," Elias said, realizing his hands were empty. "I left the Chronos." "Let him keep the shell," Elena said, grabbing his arm and pulling him into the shadows of the alleyway as sirens began to wail in the distance. "You have the map in your head, don't you?" Elias closed his eyes. The image of the blue light, the intricate web of tunnels, the pulsing red star beneath the bridge. It was burned into his retinas. "Yes," he said. "I see it." "Then run," Elena said. Before the clock strikes 0, they sprinted into the night, vanishing into the veins of the city, leaving the ticking of the workshop far behind. But in Elias's mind, the gears were still turning, counting down to an impossible hour. The fog that clung to the Blackwood district was not merely weather. It was a physical weight, a wet, gray wool that muffled the gaslights and turned the cobblestones into slick, treacherous mirrors. High above the city's industrial sprawl, perched on the precipice of the Merchant's Cliff, the Sterling estate loomed like a jagged tooth in a rotting jaw. Elias Thorne pulled the collar of his coat tighter against the biting damp. The brass chronometer in his pocket ticked against his ribs. A steady, rhythmic reminder of time slipping away, sand through a sieve. Beside him, Elena Rosetti moved with the liquid grace of a shadow detached from its caster. She didn't shiver. She didn't stumble. She was a weapon sheathed in wool and leather, her eyes scanning the perimeter of the wrought iron gates. "It looks dead," Elias whispered, his breath pluming in the chill air. "More mausoleum than manor. That's what they want you to think?" Elena murmured, her voice a low thrum that barely disturbed the silence. She crouched near the gate's hinges, examining the rust. Victor Sterling didn't spend a fortune fortifying this place just to let it rot. Look at the oxidation patterns here. This hinge was oiled recently. Within the week, Elias squinted, adjusting his spectacles. The lenses, ground to his own exacting specifications, magnified the metal. She was right. Amidst the flaking orange crust of neglect, there was a sheen of fresh, viscous lubricant. It was a machinist's oil, high-grade, smelling faintly of cloves and petroleum. The gear train cipher, Elias said, tapping his temple. The coordinates led us to the service entrance, not the front gate. We need to go around the eastern flank, near the cliff edge. Dangerous, Elena noted, though she was already moving. One slip and you're part of the jagged rocks below. The truth is rarely found on the safe path, Elena. They navigated the perimeter, the roar of the ocean crashing against the cliffs below rising to meet them. The Sterling estate was a monstrosity of Gothic revival architecture, a sprawling beast of dark stone, gargoyles, and boarded-up windows that looked like blinded eyes. It was a house built by a man who feared the light, a man who had tried to ransom time itself. As they reached the eastern wall, the wind picked up, howling through the skeletal remains of what was once a grand conservatory. Glass crunched beneath their boots, sounding uncomfortably like breaking bones. Here, Elias said, stopping before a section of the wall that looked identical to the rest. He pulled the crumpled map from his pocket, shielding it from the mist with his body. The cipher spoke of the third weeping angel. Look, above them, set into the masonry, were a series of reliefs. Angels in varying states of despair. Elias counted to the third one. Its stone eyes were hollow, streaks of mineral deposits running down its cheeks like petrified tears. And, Elena asked, her hand resting on the revolver at her hip. And, Elias whispered, reaching up. He didn't touch the angel. Instead, he pressed his ear against the cold stone of the wall beneath it. He closed his eyes, shutting out the wind, the ocean, the cold. He listened for the heartbeat of the brass. Silence. Then *click where thump star. It's alive, he breathed. The walls are hollow. There's a mechanism running inside. He ran his sensitive fingers over the stone, feeling for the vibration. He found a loose brick not by sight, but by the subtle harmonic dissonance it created against the larger structure. He pressed it. With a groan of protesting metal and grinding stone, a section of the wall receded and slid sideways, revealing a gaping maw of darkness. The smell that wafted out was ancient. Dust, dry rot, and the sharp, coppery tang of electrified air. Ladies first, Elias said, his voice trembling slightly. Elena rolled her eyes, drew a slender, chemical flare from her belt, cracked it, and stepped into the breach. The blue light washed over a narrow service corridor, the wallpaper peeling in long, fleshy strips. They moved in silence, the only sound the crunch of debris underfoot. The interior of the Sterling estate was a testament to madness. Furniture was draped in white sheets that looked like shrouds. Grandfather clocks stood in every corner, dozens of them in the hallway alone, all stopped at different times. Why so many clocks? Elena whispered, sweeping her light across the faces. Sterling was obsessed with the fragmentation of moments, Elias explained, his gaze darting nervously. He believed that if you could capture enough seconds, you could build an eternity. These aren't just timepieces, Elena. They're cages. They reached the grand foyer, a cavernous space dominated by a dual staircase that swept up into the gloom. But Elias ignored the stairs. He consulted the mental image of the cipher again. * beneath the foundation of the world, the gears turn in reverse. The library, Elias said definitively. Ground floor, west wing. The library was a tomb of knowledge. Floor-to-ceiling shelves loomed over them, empty of books, looking like the ribcages of leviathans. The floor was an intricate parquet of dark mahogany and light oak, laid out in a geometric spiral. "We're looking for a specific point," Elias said, dropping to his knees. He pulled a set of calipers and a small hammer from his satchel. The cipher decoded to a frequency, for 40 hertz, the standard tuning pitch. "Elias, we don't have time for a music lesson," Elena hissed, watching the doorway. "If there are automated defenses." "This is the defense, Elena. If we force the floorboards, the whole room probably collapses into the sea. It has to be resonated open." Elias began to tap the floorboards with his hammer.
Asterisk top.
Thud, clack, asterisk. He moved in a spiral, spiraling inward toward the center of the room. He looked like a mad prospector searching for gold in wood.
Asterisk top.
Thud, ping. He froze. "Did you hear that?" "It sounded like metal," Elena said, stepping closer. "Resonance," Elias corrected. He cleared the dust away from a specific oak slat. It looked identical to the others, but when he placed the tip of his calipers against it, he could feel a minute vibration. "Stand back," Elias commanded. He took a tuning fork from his kit, a heavy iron thing, struck it against the heel of his boot, and pressed the stem against the wood. The note hummed through the room, a pure, wavering tone. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the floor beneath them shuddered. The parquet pattern began to shift. The wood retracted, folding in on itself like an origami puzzle, revealing a spiral staircase of wrought iron descending into the earth. "The bunker," Elena said, peering down. "You brilliant, terrifying little man. I merely understand the language of things that tick." Elias deflected, though a flush of pride warmed his pale cheeks. They descended. The air grew warmer, heavier. The smell of rot faded, replaced by the scent of ozone and hot oil. The silence of the house above was replaced by a low, rhythmic thrumming, a mechanical heartbeat that vibrated in their teeth. At the bottom of the stairs, a heavy steel blast door stood ajar. Beyond it lay a space that defied the ruin above. It was a cathedral of industry. The bunker was massive, spanning the entire footprint of the estate. Brass pipes hissed with steam, running along the ceiling like arteries. In the center of the room stood a machine of terrifying complexity. A Babbage engine the size of a locomotive, its thousands of gear columns spinning in a blur of calculation. Punch cards fed into it from overhead hoppers like a waterfall of paper. And at the heart of the machine, suspended in a harness of leather and copper, was a man. "Victor," Elias whispered. Victor Sterling was a ruin of a man, reflecting the estate above. His legs were withered, useless things, but his upper body was encased in a mechanized exoskeleton. Brass pistons moved with his arms. Pneumatic tubes pulsed with a glowing blue fluid that fed directly into his neck. He was typing furiously at a console, his back to them. "He's plugged in," Elena said, horror in her voice. Victor stopped typing. The great machine slowed, the whir of gears dropping to a menacing idle. The chair rotated slowly. Victor Sterling's face was a map of time's cruelty, deep fissures of wrinkles, skin like parchment. But his eyes were bright, electric blue, manic and sharp. "Mr. Thorne," Victor rasped, his voice amplified by a vox box around his throat. It sounded like grinding stones. "And Ms. Rosetti, you represent a variable I had not calculated for this evening's equation." "It's over, Victor," Elena said, raising her revolver. "Step away from the machine." Victor laughed, a dry, hacking sound. Step away? My dear, I am the machine. My heart beats only because the Chronos engine dictates the rhythm. If I disconnect, I die. If I die, the engine stops. If the engine stops, well, the ransom is forfeited. Elias stepped forward, his eyes darting over the spinning columns of the engine. He was reading the calculations. You're not calculating coordinates, Elias realized, his voice trembling. You're calculating a paradox. You're trying to solve the temporal dissonance of the vanished hour. Victor's eyes narrowed. You have a keen mind, watchmaker. Yes, the hour that was stolen from me. The hour my wife died. The world moved on, ticked forward, indifferent. But I found the flaw in the gears of the universe. A slip gear in reality. The Chronos ransom, Elias said. You're holding the city hostage. Not for money, but for energy. You're drawing power from the city's grid to punch a hole backwards. If you succeed, Elias continued, his voice rising, the backlash won't just bring her back. It will shatter the timeline of the present. The Blackwood district, the city, it will all be unwritten to fuel your revision. A small price, Victor roared, and the pistons on his arms hissed. For perfection, for love. It's not love, Elena said coldly. It's possession. Victor slammed his hand onto a lever. Guards. From the shadows of the workshop, figures emerged. They were not men. They were automatons, hulking shapes of bronze and porcelain, their faces blank masks, their movements jerky but powerful. Steam vented from their joints as they advanced. Elias, work the machine, Elena shouted, firing a shot that sparked harmlessly off the brass chest of the lead automaton. I'll buy you time. I can't just turn it off, Elias yelled, rushing toward the console as Victor manipulated the controls to shield himself. It's a closed loop. If I sever the connection abruptly, the stored energy detonates. Then figure it out. Elena ducked under a swinging metal fist, drove her shoulder into the automaton's knee joint, and fired point-blank into its exposed wiring. The machine spasmed and collapsed, but 3 more were closing in. Elias scrambled up the gantry, avoiding the grasping claw of a mechanical arm Victor swiped at him. He reached the secondary input terminal. The heat was intense here. The punch cards fluttered like terrified moths. He looked at the sequence. It was a chaotic storm of logic gates and recursive algorithms. Victor was trying to force a square peg into a round hole of existence. To stop it, Elias didn't need to break the machine. He needed to solve the equation. He needed to prove to the machine that Victor's request was impossible. Think, Elias, think, he muttered to himself, sweat stinging his eyes. Below, the sounds of violence were deafening. Elena was a blur of motion, using the environment against the lumbering automatons, luring them into steam vents and tripping them with loose cables. But she was tiring. A backhand blow caught her, sending her skidding across the oil-slicked floor. Elena! Elias screamed. Keep working! She coughed, scrambling to her feet, blood trickling from her lip. Elias forced his focus back to the keys. The gear train cipher. It hadn't just been a map to the house. It was a primer on Victor's logic. Asterisk, the gears turn in reverse. He's using a base 12 system, Elias realized aloud. Like a clock face, but the universe runs on chaos. Elias began to type. He didn't try to shut down the power. Instead, he introduced a variable. A logical fallacy. He fed the machine a question it couldn't answer. Asterisk, if the past is changed, who remains to change it? He translated the paradox into binary punch code. The machine hesitated. The deafening roar of the gears stuttered. A high-pitched whine began to build, rising in frequency until it drilled into their skulls. "What are you doing?" Victor screamed, struggling against his harness as the console sparked. "The logic flow. It's inverting." "I'm giving you what you wanted, Victor," Elias yelled over the noise. "You wanted to capture time? Here it is. All of it at once." The Babbage engine shuddered violently. A main drive belt snapped with the sound of a gunshot, whipping through the air and shattering a bank of glass gauges. Steam erupted, blinding and white. The automatons froze, their instructions severed by the central core's confusion. Elena slumped against a pillar, breathing hard, her gun hanging loosely from her hand. Victor shrieked, a sound of pure mechanical agony, as the feedback loop hit his exoskeleton. The blue fluid in the tubes turned a violent, boiling red. "Elias, the pressure," Elena warned, pointing to the main boiler gauge. The needle was buried in the red zone. "We have to go. Now." Elias scrambled down the ladder, grabbing Elena's arm. "My work," Victor wailed, unable to move, trapped in the center of his self-made purgatory. The machine was eating itself, gears grinding against gears, stripping teeth, sparks showering down like fireworks. "You cannot stop the hands of fate. Fate isn't a clock you can rewind, Victor," Elias said, a rare moment of steel in his voice. He looked at the antagonist one last time, a genius consumed by his own refusal to accept grief. The bunker groaned, the steel ceiling plates buckling. "Run!" They sprinted for the spiral stairs. The heat was rising rapidly, scorching their backs. They scrambled up the iron rungs, lungs burning, just as a concussive boom shook the foundation. They burst out into the library, dust billowing around them. The floorboards were shaking violently. The cliffside,
Elena shouted.
"The explosion will destabilize the foundation." They didn't stop. They ran through the dark hallways, past the shrouded furniture and the silent clocks, bursting out into the cold, wet night just as the ground beneath the Sterling estate gave way. With a sound like the earth tearing apart, the west wing of the manor, the library, the study, the hidden bunker beneath, slid slowly, majestically, into the ocean below. The crash was swallowed by the roar of the waves, leaving only a cloud of dust and steam rising into the fog. Elias and Elena stood at the edge of the safe ground, gasping for air, the rain mingling with the sweat on their faces. Elias clutched his chest, checking his pocket. The chronometer was still ticking, steady, unyielding. "Is it over?" Elena asked, wiping blood from her chin. Elias watched the steam dissipate over the dark water. He thought of the punch cards, the variable he had introduced. He had stopped the immediate threat, yes, but he had seen something on the monitor in those final seconds. A transmission. Victor hadn't just been trying to rewrite the past. He had been signaling someone, or something. "The machine is destroyed," Elias said quietly. "But the ransom." He pulled a crumpled piece of punch card he'd snatched from the output tray. The pattern of holes was unfamiliar, alien even to him. "What is it?" "Victor was sending data," Elias said, the dread settling into his stomach heavier than the stone of the manor. Before the core overloaded, he broadcast the cipher key, not to the past, but to a receiver in the city.
Elena defied.
"Who?" Elias looked back toward the glowing lights of the Blackwood district, visible through the clearing fog. The city looked peaceful, unaware that it had almost been unwritten. "I don't know," Elias whispered. "But the machine wasn't the bomb, Elena. It was the fuse, and I think we just lit it." The wind howled, carrying the sound of a distant clock tower striking midnight. The new day had begun, but Elias had a sinking feeling that their time was just running out. The heavy oak doors of the Sterling Gallery groaned as Elias Thorne pushed them open, the sound echoing like the low moan of a dying beast. Inside, the air was thick, suspended in a cocktail of dust, furniture polish, and the metallic tang of old brass. But it was the sound that hit him first, a rhythmic, pervasive thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the soles of his shoes. Asterisk tick, tock, tick, tock. It wasn't the gentle heartbeat of the pocket watches Elias repaired in his shop on Cobbled Distinct. It was a mechanical roar, the sound of time being devoured in great, greedy gulps. "It's here," Elena Rosetti whispered, her voice trembling. She stepped out from behind Elias, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The Chronos, at the far end of the gallery, dominating a wall of dark mahogany paneling, stood the machine. It was less a clock and more a cathedral of gears. Standing 12 feet tall, the Chronos was a monstrosity of exposed escapements, gravity arms, and pendulums the size of broadswords. It was the masterwork of the vanished artisan Julian Vane, the man whose kidnapping a century ago had sparked the mystery Elias and Elena had spent the last week unraveling. "Victor kept it running?" Elias murmured, moving closer. His eyes, trained to spot the microscopic flaw in a hairspring, now tried to take in the sheer, brutal scale of the mechanism. All these years, the Sterling family kept the evidence of their crime ticking away in their own living room. Elena moved toward a smaller cabinet integrated into the clock's pedestal. "The cipher from the gear train in Chapter 4, she said, her breathing shallow. It pointed to the base. Where the weight falls, the truth lies. Elias grabbed her arm gently.
"Careful, Elena."
"This isn't just a timekeeper. Vane designed security systems for banks before he was taken. This whole thing is a lock. And we have the key," she said, pulling the brass winding key they had recovered from the workshop shadows in Chapter 3. The room felt claustrophobic despite its size. The shadows stretching from the high-backed chairs and velvet drapes seemed to lean toward them. Elias looked at the Chronos. The massive brass weight, suspended by a steel cable, was nearing the bottom of its travel. "Do it," Elias said, scanning the room, his instincts screaming that they were exposed.
Elena knelt.
She inserted the brass key into a hidden aperture beneath the main pendulum bob, to fit with a satisfying, oily click. She turned it. A latch triggered. A hidden drawer in the pedestal popped open with a puff of stale air that smelled of dried ink and betrayal. Inside lay a leather-bound ledger and a stack of yellowed letters. Elena's hands shook as she lifted the ledger. "It's all here," she choked out, flipping the brittle pages. The ransom payments, the dates, the signatures of Victor's grandfather. They didn't just kidnap Vane. They forced him to build this engine to launder the stolen bonds. They kept him prisoner for 20 years. Touching, a voice smoothed over the room, cool and sharp as a razor blade. "Truly, I always suspected there was a historian's passion in you, Miss Rosetti." Elias spun around. Victor Sterling stood in the open doorway, framed by the light of the hallway. He wore a tuxedo, the bow tie undone, hanging loose around his neck like a noose. In his right hand, a matte black pistol was leveled at Elias's chest. "Victor," Elias said, keeping his voice steady, though his heart hammered against his ribs in double time. "It's over. We have the ledger." Victor stepped into the room, kicking the door shut behind him. The heavy thud was swallowed by the relentless ticking of the Chronos. "A book is just paper, Elias. Paper burns. Just as history is rewritten by the victors. Or, in this case, the Sterlings. You can't burn the truth," Elena said, clutching the ledger to her chest, defiant despite the gun. "Your family's fortune is built on blood and slavery. Julian Vane died in this house. He lived in luxury. Victor snapped, his composure cracking for a fraction of a second, revealing the manic desperation beneath. My grandfather gave him a purpose. He built the greatest timekeeping mechanism the world has ever seen. And you want to destroy that legacy because of some misplaced morality? He was a prisoner, Elias said quietly. He was analyzing Victor, measuring the distance between them 20 feet. Too far to rush. And now you're the jailer. Victor walked forward, the gun never wavering. I am the custodian, and I am tidying up. Put the book on the floor, Elena. Kick it to me. Then perhaps I'll let you leave. Elias, however. He shifted his aim slightly toward the clockmaker's head. Elias knows too much about how things work. Elias's mind raced. He looked at the gun, then back at the Chronos behind him. The machine was a marvel of kinetic energy. The massive weights were heavy enough to crush a man. The mainspring barrel was under immense tension. You don't want to shoot in here, Victor? Elias said, raising his hands slowly. Victor scoffed. Why? Because I might scratch the paint? Because of the vibration. Elias lied, hoping his technical jargon would baffle the aristocrat. The Chronos utilizes a resonance-based escapement. A gunshot, the percussive shockwave in this enclosed space, could shatter the crystalline governor inside the central shaft. The whole machine would tear itself apart. Victor hesitated. His eyes flicked to the massive clock, then back to Elias. You're bluffing. Am I? Elias took a half step back, closer to the machine. Look at the pendulum, Victor. It's synchronized to the room's acoustics. Vane designed it that way. You fire that weapon, you destroy your grandfather's legacy faster than any police report could. It was nonsense, pure, unadulterated technobabble, but Elias delivered it with the conviction of a surgeon explaining a diagnosis. Victor was a businessman, not an engineer. He feared losing the asset more than he feared the law. Fine, Victor hissed, lowering the gun slightly but not holstering it. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a lighter. Then we do this the old-fashioned way. Give me the book, Elena. I'll burn it right here. Then you can leave. Elena looked at Elias. Elias gave a microscopic nod.
Okay, Elena whispered.
She stepped forward, placing the ledger on the floor. She slid it across the parquet, spun, stopping at Victor's feet. Victor smiled, a cruel, triumphant curvature of the lips. He crouched, keeping the gun trained on Elias, and reached for the book with his left hand. Smart girl. Now, Elias shouted. Elias didn't lunge for Victor. He lunged for the Chronos. He grabbed the massive brass counterweight, which was hovering just inches off the floor, and he hauled it upward with every ounce of strength he possessed. By lifting the weight, he effectively removed the drive force from the gear train. But he didn't just hold it. He disengaged the ratchet pawl on the winding drum, a lever he had spotted earlier, the fail-safe Vane had installed. No, Victor screamed, realizing too late that the threat wasn't the gun, but the clock. Elias released the weight. It didn't fall. Because he had disengaged the ratchet, the energy didn't go into lifting the weight. The potential energy stored in the massive mainspring was suddenly unleashed in reverse. The Chronos screamed. It was a sound like a freight train derailment. The winding drum spun freely, the ratchet clicking so fast it sounded like a machine gun. The gears, no longer regulated by the escapement, accelerated to breakneck speeds. Asterisk whir crack. The brass cable whipped around, lashing out like a golden serpent. Victor flinched, shielding his face, and the gun fired wild, the bullet burying itself in the ceiling plaster. Run! Elias yelled, grabbing Elena's hand. The machine was self-destructing. Vane's final revenge. The centrifugal force was tearing the governor apart. Brass teeth stripped from gears and flew across the room like shrapnel. A heavy steel spring exploded from the casing, slicing through the air where Victor had been standing a second before. Victor scrambled back, clutching the ledger, but the room was turning into a chaotic storm of metal. The massive pendulum, thrown off its rhythm, swung violently sideways, smashing into the glass casing of the cabinet. Shards of glass rained down. "My clock!" Victor howled, trying to shield the ledger and the machine simultaneously. "Stop it! Make it stop! It can't be stopped!" Elias shouted over the deafening roar of grinding metal. He pulled Elena behind a heavy, overturned table. "Time's up, Sterling." The main drive chain snapped. It whipped through the air with the force of a cannon shot. It struck the mahogany pillar next to Victor, obliterating the wood. Victor dived, dropping the ledger. The book slid across the floor, coming to rest near the shattered remains of the clock face. The Chronos gave one final, shuddering groan. The upper assembly, destabilized by the violence of the unwinding, tilted forward. "Victor, look out!" Elena screamed, her humanity overriding her hatred. Victor looked up. The 12-foot tower of brass and timber, the idol of his family's greed, was tipping. He scrambled backward, his heels slipping on the polished floor, but he wasn't fast enough to save the ledger. The Chronos crashed down. The sound was earth-shattering. The floorboards buckled. Dust billowed up in a choking gray cloud. The heavy oak casing smashed directly onto the spot where the ledger lay, pulverizing the floor beneath it and trapping Victor's legs under the upper debris field of the clock's crown. Silence rushed back into the room, ringing in Elias's ears. The ticking had finally stopped. "My legs!" Victor's voice was a whimper, rising from the dust cloud. "I can't feel my legs." Elias coughed, waving the dust away. He stood up slowly, his body aching, adrenaline fading into a cold tremble. He helped Elena to her feet. She was pale, staring at the wreckage. They walked cautiously toward the ruin. Victor was pinned, not by the heavy machinery, but by the wooden casing. He was trapped, terrified, but alive. Elias looked down at the wreckage. Beneath a shattered cog the size of a dinner plate, the ledger was visible. It was battered, the cover torn, but the pages were intact. The machine had destroyed itself, but it had protected the truth. "Vane knew," Elias said softly, picking up the ledger. He dusted off a piece of glass. "He designed it to fail if it was tampered with by anyone who didn't understand the respect time deserves. You broke it." Victor spat, tears streaming down his dust-caked face. "You destroyed a masterpiece." "No, Victor," Elena said, her voice steel. She looked down at him with a mixture of pity and disgust. "We just broke the silence." In the distance, the wail of sirens began to bleed through the walls of the estate. The gunshot had been heard. The interrogation room at the precinct was cold, smelling of stale coffee and industrial cleaner, a stark contrast to the oil and mahogany of the Sterling estate. Elias sat on a metal chair, a foil blanket draped over his shoulders. Elena sat beside him, clutching a paper cup of tea with both hands. Detectives bustled around them, bagging the ledger, taking statements. The Chronos ransom was no longer a myth. It was case number 84-209. "He'll go away for a long time," the lead detective said, pausing by their table. "Attempted murder plus the fraud we're uncovering in those books. It goes back generations. The Sterling fortune is going to be frozen, seized, and likely dissolved."
Elena nodded slowly.
"And Julian Vane? Will he be recognized?" "We found the remains," the detective said gently. In the sub-basement, behind a false wall. We're confirming with dental records, but he's been found, Miss Rosetti. You can take him home. Elena closed her eyes, a single tear tracking through the grime on her cheek. She reached out and took Elias's hand. Her grip was tight. Thank you. Elias squeezed back. He was a craftsman. He deserved to be known for his work, not his disappearance. You used the clock against him, Elena said, opening her eyes and looking at Elias. That technical talk about resonance. That was nonsense, wasn't it? Elias offered a tired, crooked smile. Complete gibberish. But the mechanics of the mainspring, that was real. Potential energy, Elena. It has to go somewhere. If you don't let it out slowly, tick by tick, it explodes. Like secrets, she mused. Exactly like secrets. 2 weeks later, the bell above the door of Thorne's horology chimed. A bright, cheerful sound that signaled a customer, not a threat. Sunlight streamed through the dusty front windows, illuminating the thousands of dancing motes of dust that floated between the ticking clocks. The shop was a symphony of soft rhythms, a sanctuary of order. Elias sat at his workbench, his loop screwed into his eye. He was working on a simple carriage clock, resetting the hairspring. It was mundane work, repetitive and precise, and he loved it. You're late, he said without looking up. Traffic on 5th, Elena said, closing the door behind her. She looked different, lighter. The weight of a century-old ghost was gone from her shoulders. She carried a rectangular box wrapped in brown paper. She walked to the counter and placed the box down. I have something for you. Elias set down his tweezers and removed his loop. He walked over, wiping his hands on his apron. I told you no payment necessary. The story was payment enough. Open it. Elias peeled back the paper. Inside was a wooden box. He lifted the lid. Resting on blue velvet was a single gear. It was brass, intricately carved with filigree that looked like vines. It was damaged, 3 teeth were bent, and there was a deep scratch across the surface. But the craftsmanship was unmistakable. It's the escapement wheel from the Chronos, Elena said softly. The police released the debris. I'm donating the mechanism to the museum or what's left of it. But I wanted you to have the heart. Elias picked up the wheel. It was heavy, cold, and beautiful. He ran his thumb over the bent teeth. He could feel the history in the metal. The hours of labor Vane had poured into it. The years it had ticked away in the dark, marking time for a crime. It's broken, Elias said. It is, Elena agreed. But you can fix things, Elias. That's what you do. Elias looked at the gear, then up at the wall of clocks behind him. Hundreds of faces, hundreds of hands, all moving forward. None of them looked back. No, Elias said, placing the gear gently back in the box. I think I'll leave this one exactly as it is. A reminder of what? Elias looked at Elena, his eyes warm. That we don't own time. We just look after it for a little while. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his own silver pocket watch. He clicked it open. The second hand swept smoothly around the dial. Lunch? He asked.
Elena smiled.
I have time. Elias flipped the sign on the door to closed. He didn't lock the door. He didn't feel the need to hide away anymore. They stepped out into the bustling city street, leaving the shop behind. Inside, on the counter, the brass gear lay still in its velvet bed. But all around it, the shop continued its endless, comforting chorus. Asterisk tick. Tock. Tick. Tock. The past was broken. The future was waiting to be wound.